I could hear the HOA president's voice screeching before I even saw her. "Mr. Nolan, that Jeep is an eyesore," she barked from across the cul-de-sac, arms flailing like she was landing a plane herself. Her name was Edith Zimmerman, and she was everything you'd expect from a middle-aged HOA tyrant: oversized sunglasses, a clipboard, and a permanent scowl like she smelled bad cheese 24/7. I was just getting home from my shift. I'm a helicopter mechanic for the county search and rescue, and yeah, I drive a slightly lifted, mud-splattered Jeep Wrangler. Big deal. It fits in my driveway, doesn't block the sidewalk. But to Edith, my Jeep was apparently some kind of domestic terrorism. "You've been warned twice already," she snapped, marching up her freshly mulched sidewalk like a woman on a mission from Satan himself. "You park that jungle vehicle in plain sight again and I'll fine you another $200. This neighborhood has standards." I checked the bylaws, Edith. "There's nothing in there about driveway vehicles as long as they're registered and don't obstruct traffic," I said, leaning against the hood. Her nose twitched. "Well, as president, I reserve the right to interpret the rules. And frankly, your Jeep depreciates the value of the homes on this street." I stared at her. "You're serious?" "You'll receive the fine in the mail," she said, turning on her heel, and she wasn't bluffing. 3 days later, I got a bill $200 for vehicle non-compliance. I appealed it. They denied it without explanation. Edith had stacked the HOA board with her friends, retired busybodies who lived for this kind of petty drama. They'd overturned my appeal before I could even finish my morning coffee. That's when I decided if they had a problem with the Jeep, they were going to absolutely hate what I did next. Now, I wasn't just a mechanic. I had a commercial rotorcraft license and a friend who owned a small Robinson helicopter. I called in a favor and got permission to borrow it for a weekend. I made sure every permit was in place, every FAA regulation followed to the letter. And that Saturday, I woke up at dawn, grabbed my flight bag, and headed to the nearby airfield. By noon, I was hovering above the community center parking lot, the one Edith had just had repaved with HOA funds and bragged about in her monthly newsletter like she paved it herself with gold. I circled once. Twice. Then, with surgical precision, I lowered the helicopter onto an empty section of the lot, right between the mailbox kiosk and the decorative fountain. The rotor wash kicked up mulch and flung a few lawn chairs across the grass. People screamed. Lawn gnomes toppled. And then Edith came storming out of her house like a demon in yoga pants. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, hair whipping in the wind. I shut down the engine, slid open the door, and climbed out with a grin. "Parking. Thought this spot might be a little more aesthetic for you." Her mouth flapped, but no sound came out. I added, "By the way, I followed every aviation reg. FAA Form 8210 filed. Local ordinance cleared, no violations." "Want to fine me again?" She was still blinking like she'd just watched her dog learn how to use a toaster when the neighbors started to gather, whispering, laughing, filming the whole thing. I crossed my arms. "So, we still mad about the Jeep?" Edith didn't say a word as I walked past her. Her eyes were locked on the helicopter, her jaw tight enough to crack a walnut. A few neighbors had started clapping, nothing dramatic, just a few slow, amused hand claps from folks who'd been on the receiving end of her interpretations before. I didn't hang around. I'd made my point. Later that evening, I was back at my place, wrench in hand, adjusting the rear drive shaft on the Jeep when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. "Mr. Nolan, this is Officer DeLeon with the County Sheriff's Department. We received a complaint about an unauthorized aircraft landing in a residential zone today. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I stood up straight. "Sure, officer, but before we start, I filed all the necessary paperwork. FAA clearance, municipal approval for temporary landing. I've got it all in a folder if you want to swing by." There was a pause. "You did, that wasn't mentioned in the complaint, figured it wouldn't be, but yeah, fully legal. I even had ground spotters and followed airspace restrictions." Another pause. "Okay. That lines up with what the tower at the airfield said. Thanks for your time. He hung up. I stared at the phone for a second, then laughed to myself. Edith had tried to escalate, and it backfired, but that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a notice taped to my front door. Mandatory compliance hearing vehicular and aerial nuisance violations. Below that, in bold, were the words failure to appear will result in daily fines. I leaned in. No signature, no board vote mentioned. Just a date and time for the hearing set for the following evening at the community clubhouse. I brought the flyer inside, sat at my kitchen table, and pulled out the HOA handbook. I flipped through the pages until I found the section on disciplinary hearings. According to their own rules, any hearing required a 5-member quorum, 72-hour notice, and a signed complaint from at least 2 non-board residents. Edith had skipped all of that. At that point, I decided to stop playing defense. The next morning, I took a personal day. I visited the county records office and requested the HOA's articles of incorporation, financial filings, and their last 5 annual budgets. It took a few hours, but the clerk found them. As I flipped through the documents, something caught my eye. Line item: Community beautification, $28,000. That seemed high for seasonal flowers. I looked closer. The vendor listed was Zimmerman Landscape and Design. I nearly laughed out loud. Edith had billed the HOA for landscaping services provided by a company registered in her maiden name. I made a copy, tucked it in my bag, and kept going. Next, I visited a friend of mine, Carla, who worked as a municipal auditor. She wasn't allowed to give legal advice, but she looked over the documents I'd gathered and circled a few key points. This vendor has no contractor license on file with the state, she said. If she's billing the HOA for services under an unlicensed company, that's fraud, especially if she's on the board and not disclosing the conflict. I thanked her and left with a new plan. That evening, I walked into the clubhouse 5 minutes before the so-called hearing. 3 plastic folding tables had been pushed together in the center of the room, and seated behind them were Edith and 2 of her usual cronies, Carol, who always wore a silk scarf no matter the weather, and Vernon, who couldn't hear without his Bluetooth headset but insisted on voting anyway. That meant they hadn't even met the minimum quorum, Mr. Nolan, Edith said, not even looking up. Please take a seat. I didn't move. This hearing violates Article VI, Section 3 of your own charter. You don't have quorum and no signatures were collected. It's invalid. Carol shifted in her seat. We can waive those requirements under special circumstances. I held up the handbook. Only in cases of structural endangerment or criminal activity, neither of which applies to a legally parked Jeep or a legally landed aircraft. Edith's eyes narrowed. We're not here to debate the rules. We're here to discuss your pattern of disruption. No, I said, pulling a folder from my bag. We're here to discuss this. I placed the printed financial documents on the table. This is a copy of last year's budget. It shows nearly $30,000 paid to Zimmerman Landscape and Design, a company that's not licensed, not bonded, and I pulled out the vendor registration form, registered to your home address. Vernon leaned forward, squinting. What's he saying? Edith snatched the paper, glanced at it, and shoved it aside. Those are private documents. You had no right to access them. Actually, I said, holding up the county librarian's stamped approval, as a resident I have every right to inspect HOA expenditures under state transparency laws. Carol looked uncomfortable now. Edith, is that true? Edith didn't answer. She stood up, flustered. This isn't the time or place, then let's find the right time and place, I interrupted. I've already scheduled a meeting with the County Ethics Board, and I've filed a preliminary complaint with the Department of Consumer Affairs. I'm also considering a class action lawsuit for misappropriation of funds. The room went quiet. Even Vernon took out his headset. Unless, I added, you'd like to avoid all that by stepping down and calling for a full audit, voluntarily. Edith's jaw clenched. You're bluffing. I handed her a copy of the complaint form, complete with case number. Not even a little. By the time I walked out of the clubhouse, the three of them were still sitting there. Neighbors who'd wandered in out of curiosity were whispering near the coffee table. I didn't say a word, I just nodded and left. The next morning, an email went out to the entire community. Edith was taking a leave of absence due to personal matters. Carol and Vernon had resigned from the board. An interim election was announced. I didn't run. I didn't need to. The Jeep still sits in my driveway, tires a little muddy from the mountain trail I hit last weekend. No one said a word about it since. The morning after the resignation email went out, I opened my front door to find a folded note tucked into the crack. No envelope, just a piece of printer paper with shaky handwriting. It read, "Thank you." About time someone stood up to her. Greg, Lot 17. I hadn't spoken to Greg more than a few times. He was a retired lineman with a stiff knee and a habit of grilling in the driveway with his shirt off, but apparently, he'd been watching. Over the next few days, little acknowledgments like that started popping up. A thumbs up from the mail carrier. A nod from a woman passing while walking her labradoodle. Even the teenager from 3 houses down, who usually avoided eye contact, gave me a quiet, cool helicopter dude. The interim HOA board, now consisting of 3 neighbors who hadn't been handpicked by Edith, scheduled a special community meeting for the following Saturday. The agenda was simple: discuss audit procedures, propose amendments to the bylaws, and address the suspicious landscaping payments. That morning I showed up early. Not because I had anything to prove, but because I'd been contacted by someone unexpected. Detective Mira Valdez from the county's Financial Crimes Division. She'd left a card on my windshield 2 days prior, asking me to call. When I did, she asked if I'd be willing to meet her at the community meeting. Apparently, my complaint to the Department of Consumer Affairs had triggered a more serious investigation. Edith's landscaping invoices weren't just inflated, they had been tied to multiple fake companies registered under different variations of her name, all funneling money from HOAs across 3 neighborhoods. I sat in the back row of the clubhouse as neighbors trickled in, some with fold-out chairs, others standing along the walls. The room was packed, probably the highest turnout the HOA had ever seen. Detective Valdez slipped in quietly and nodded to me, blending in like she wasn't carrying a badge and a warrant in her shoulder bag. Ravi, the new interim chair who worked in IT and had no patience for nonsense, opened the meeting. "First things first," he said, tapping the mic. "We've received documentation from multiple homeowners regarding questionable expenditures under the former board's tenure. We've initiated a full forensic audit through an independent firm." Someone in the crowd asked, "Will we get to see the results?" "Absolutely," Ravi replied. "Transparency's the whole point." Then he turned to me. "Mr. Nolan, I believe you had something to add." I stood, not because I wanted attention, but because I had one last piece to unveil, something I hadn't even told Detective Valdez yet. "I did some digging," I began. "And I found that the original HOA charter was amended 5 years ago in a closed-door session. That amendment gave the president unilateral spending authority for all beautification projects under $50,000 without requiring a vote." A few gasps rippled through the room. Ravi frowned. "That amendment wasn't in the version we were given." "I didn't think it would be," I said. "It was filed with the county, but the updated charter was never distributed to homeowners." It gave Edith carte blanche to funnel money to her fake companies without oversight. Detective Valdez stepped forward then, holding a small folder. "That matches the pattern we've seen in 2 other developments nearby. We believe the same scheme was used to siphon over $200,000 in total." There was a pause, then murmurs. Then something deeper, a shift in the room, the kind that happens when people realize they've been fooled for years. Valdez continued, We have sufficient grounds to issue a warrant for Edith Zimmerman's arrest for wire fraud, falsifying municipal documents, and embezzlement. She was taken into custody this morning. The room erupted not in chaos, but in stunned disbelief. A few people clapped. Others just stood there, jaws slack. I sat back down as the weight of it sank in. This wasn't just about a jeep or a helicopter or some petty fines. It was about a woman who'd been siphoning money from her neighbors under the guise of community pride. After the meeting, Ravi approached me with a clipboard. "We're rewriting the bylaws from scratch," he said. "Want to help?" I hesitated. "I'm not a politician. I turn wrenches for a living. You're the reason we even have a chance to fix this." I took the clipboard. Over the next few weeks, I worked with a small team of neighbors people I barely knew before all this to rebuild the HOA into something functional. We included strict financial transparency requirements, term limits, and a public vote for every expenditure over $500. We even set up a rotating oversight committee made up of volunteers who weren't allowed to serve on the board. Every document we created had digital copies posted on the new community website, visible to every homeowner. The first time someone asked if I wanted to run for the permanent board, I laughed. I'd had enough of meetings, but I agreed to stay on the oversight committee, just in case. One evening, while walking back from the mailbox, I passed by Greg from Lot 17. He was sitting on his porch, beer in hand, a radio playing some old blues track. "Hey, Nolan," he called out. "You ever think about landing that chopper again? Maybe during the 4th of July cookout," I grinned. "Only if someone tries to outlaw hot dogs next." He let out a wheezy laugh and raised his beer. I turned back toward my house, the Jeep parked neatly in the driveway, a fresh coat of trail dust clinging to the bumper. No warning notes, no fines. No clipboard-wielding tyrants lurking behind hydrangeas. Just a quiet neighborhood finally under new management. The midsummer air hung heavy as I walked through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, not mine, but Ravi's. He'd asked me to help gather homeowners' signatures for one last reform proposal, requiring a full third-party audit every fiscal year. I wasn't crazy about knocking on doors, but after everything that had gone down, I figured a few signatures were a small price to pay for final accountability. Halfway down Birchwood Lane, I stopped in front of a house with peeling shutters and a crooked bird bath. It belonged to a soft-spoken woman named Lillian, who usually kept to herself. She opened the door after a few knocks, wearing gardening gloves and holding a trowel caked in damp soil. "I heard about the audit," she said before I even said hello. "Anything to keep someone like Edith from pulling another fast one. Where do I sign?" After she scribbled her name, she leaned in slightly. "You know, I always wondered why she kept pressuring me to sell my lot. Said it was underutilized. I even found flyers from a developer in my mailbox, no postage, just slipped in. That stopped me cold." "Which developer?" I asked. She disappeared inside for a moment and came back with a trifold brochure. On the back, in fine print, was a company name I recognized from the budget documents I'd unearthed during the early days of this mess: Ridge Point Ventures. I thanked her and took the flyer to Ravi's place. He was in his garage, rewiring a security system he'd installed himself. When I handed him the brochure, he stopped what he was doing and stared at it like it had personally insulted him. "I've seen that name," he said. "They submitted a proposal to build townhomes on the South Slope, but the zoning board rejected it last year. Not enough drainage infrastructure. And now they're trying to carve up private lots from inside," I said. He nodded slowly. "Let's pull the last 5 years of meeting minutes." Everything Edith chaired. We spent the next 4 hours in Ravi's home office, scanning PDFs and flagged notes, circling every reference to Ridge Point Ventures. By the time we were done, we had 8 different notations of beautification, unused property, or community development opportunity, all linked to vague budget line items or private conversations Edith had with homeowners who'd since moved out. It wasn't just about landscaping fraud anymore. This was property manipulation and possibly coercion. The next step was obvious. I made an appointment with the County Planning Enforcement Office. The clerk, a guy who looked like he hadn't had a lunch break in 5 years, took one look at the documents and called someone from the back office. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from a woman in a navy blazer named Meena Patel, head of zoning compliance. She studied the materials in silence, flipping pages quickly but not carelessly. "You have proof that any homeowners were forced to sell?" she asked finally. "Not yet," I said. "But I can find them. Lillian's still here. The rest, I'll track them down." "You do that," Meena said, standing. "And I'll contact the district attorney's office. If there's evidence the HOA colluded with a developer to pressure sales under the table, that's real estate fraud. Possibly racketeering." I left the office with my heart pounding. Over the next week, I tracked down 3 of the former homeowners. One had moved out of state. Another was living with her daughter in the next town over. The third, Miguel, had taken a buyout and relocated to an apartment complex nearby. Each one told a similar story. Edith had approached them privately sometimes with a board member in tow, suggesting that their non-compliant landscaping or multiple vehicle warnings could be resolved if they considered selling. The buyer, never named directly. But the offers came with contracts that mentioned Ridge Point Ventures in the fine print. Miguel had saved a copy of his. I sent it to Meena. She looped in Detective Valdez, and 2 days later, there was a formal investigation launched through the district attorney's office. Not just into the HOA, but into Ridge Point Ventures and its local representative, a man named Byron Lasky, who turned out to be Edith's cousin. The case moved fast from there. By the end of the month, a grand jury had indicted Edith on 6 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of real estate coercion, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit racketeering. Byron was named as an unindicted co-conspirator pending further federal review. The charges carried prison time real time, not just fines and warnings. At the next community meeting, Ravi stood at the front of the clubhouse, flanked by 2 new board members, Tanya, a former paralegal, and Edward, a retired city inspector. "We've got news," he said, tapping the microphone. "The district attorney has filed charges against Edith Zimmerman and her known associates. The HOA will be cooperating fully. And thanks to the signatures you helped collect, we are moving forward with a mandatory annual audit policy effective immediately." There was no cheering. Not this time. Just a quiet wave of relief that passed from one person to the next, neighbors nodding, shoulder tension easing, people actually looking each other in the eye again. After the meeting, I stepped outside for air, leaning against the railing by the community center steps. The dusk was setting in, casting slow-moving shadows across the lot. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Tanya. "You did a lot of good," she said. "You ever think about running for real this time?" I shook my head. "I'm good where I am," she smiled. "Well, the oversight committee's got a permanent seat if you want it." I didn't answer right away. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the flag at the corner of the lot. I watched it for a moment. "Maybe," I said finally. "But only if I don't have to wear a tie." She laughed and walked back inside. A few weeks later, the helicopter made one last appearance, not as a stunt, but for a community event. The new board had organized a fundraiser for local wildfire relief, and someone suggested a raffle prize for a scenic ride. I made a few calls, pulled a few strings, and got clearance for a brief hover demo at the community park. Families showed up with lawn chairs. Kids made paper rotor blades out of construction paper. Even Greg from Lot 17 brought a cooler full of sweet tea and sat in the shade like he owned the place. When I lifted off, hovering just above the treetops, the neighborhood looked different. Not just from the air, but in the way people stood together, shoulder to shoulder. No clipboards in sight. Justice hadn't just landed, it had taken off.